The notice didn't arrive with a knock or a warning, just a thin white envelope tucked neatly under my mailbox, flagged like it had every right to be there. No return address anyone would recognize, just the familiar HOA logo stamped in the corner, the kind that always carried trouble, the kind that never meant anything good. I remember standing there longer than necessary, the envelope still sealed in my hand, already feeling that tight pressure in my chest that came from knowing someone, somewhere, had decided my home was their business again. This neighborhood had always looked peaceful from the outside, clean sidewalks, trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, and houses painted in approved shades that blended into a perfect, soulless harmony. The HOA loved to call it community standards. I had learned to call it control. I'd lived here long, enough to know that every smile from the board came with an inspection checklist hiding behind it. When I finally opened the notice, it was exactly what I expected, and somehow worse at the same time. A formal violation, a reference to a section of the bylaws so obscure it sounded like it had been written specifically to catch people off guard. A deadline, a fine amount, highlighted in bold, as if that made it more legitimate. And a closing sentence that felt less like a request and more like a threat, reminding me that failure to comply could result in further action. The reason listed was laughably vague. Something about a non-compliant exterior condition. No photo, no Miss Champ, no explanation detailed enough to actually fix whatever they claimed was wrong. Just enough ambiguity to make sure I couldn't argue without doing homework they assumed I wouldn't do. At first, I tried to be reasonable. I walked around my property slowly, scanning every inch like an inspector myself. The lawn was trimmed. The trash bins were stored properly. No decorations, no flags out of season, no visible damage. Everything looked exactly like it had the week before, and the week before that. Nothing had changed, except apparently the HOA's mood. That was when the familiar patterns started to click into place. The board had changed recently. New members, new energy, the kind that comes from people who finally get a small amount of authority and decide to use every ounce of it. Over the past few months, neighbors had started whispering, notices for minor issues, warnings over technicalities, fines issued with no conversation beforehand. It felt less like enforcement and more like a campaign. The notice claimed I had 10 days to correct the issue or face daily penalties. 10 days to fix something they couldn't even clearly define. And I knew from experience that asking for clarification wouldn't help. Emails would go unanswered. Phone calls would be to voicemail, and any response, if it came at all, would be delayed just long enough to make sure the deadline passed. I set the notice down on my kitchen counter and stared at it like it might change its mind. For a brief moment, I considered doing what they probably expected, paying the fine, making some meaningless adjustment, letting it go. That was how the HOA usually won, not through being right, but through being exhausting. But something about this one felt different. The tone, the confidence, the assumption that I would comply without question. It rubbed me the wrong way, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about a supposed violation. It was about setting an example, about reminding homeowners who really ran things. That night, instead of drafting a quick response or venting to a neighbor, I pulled out the HOA bylaws, the full document. Pages and pages of dense language, cross-referenced sections, and rules that contradicted each other depending on how generously they were interpreted. It was the kind of document most people never read, and the HOA clearly relied on that fact. I read slowly, carefully, highlighting sections, taking notes. What started as mild curiosity turned into something sharper as I noticed inconsistencies. Rules that required notice before fines, clauses that limited the board's authority in very specific circumstances. Procedures they were supposed to follow but rarely did. By the time midnight rolled around, I wasn't tired anymore. I was alert, focused, and just a little angry. Because the more I read, the clearer it became that the notice I'd received wasn't just unfair. It was sloppy, rushed, possibly even invalid. The next morning, I checked my email. Nothing from the HOA. No follow-up. No clarification. Just silence. As if they'd already moved on, confident the process would play out the way it always did. I imagined them marking my address on a spreadsheet. Another fine added to the monthly total. Another homeowner quietly falling in line. Instead of responding immediately, I waited. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. I wanted to see if they'd escalate without provocation, and they did. 3 days later, another notice arrived. This one more aggressive. The language harsher. The fine increased. Still, no explanation beyond the same copied phrase about non-compliant exterior conditions. It felt less like enforcement now and more like pressure, designed to make me panic and pay before asking questions. That was the moment. I knew this wasn't going to be a simple back. The HOA wasn't interested in resolving an issue. They were testing boundaries. And they assumed mine were soft. I took photos of everything. The house from every angle. The yard, the sidewalk, the curb. I've documented dates, times, lighting conditions. I printed copies of the bylaws and highlighted the sections that applied. I saved every notice, every envelope, every detail. Because if this went where I suspected it might, I wanted a record that told the full story, not just the version the HOA preferred. Neighbors started to notice. A few asked casually if everything was okay, their voices low, eyes darting, like they didn't want to be overheard. I could tell they'd received similar notices recently. I could tell they were watching to see what I'd do. In neighborhoods like this, one person pushing back could change everything, or make things much worse. By the end of the week, I still hadn't responded. And that silence seemed to irritate the HOA more than any argument ever could. A third notice arrived. This one, mentioning possible legal action, liens collections, words meant to intimidate. Dropped casually as if they were routine, but buried in that threat was a mistake. A reference to a rule that didn't apply to my property, a copy-paste error that revealed just how little attention they were paying to the details. It was small, easy to miss, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That's when I realized the HOA wasn't prepared for someone who actually read the rules. They were used to authority being enough. We used to fear doing the work for them. And in their rush to assert control, they'd overlooked something critical. They'd underestimated how far I was willing to go once I realized they were bluffing. As I organized my notes and prepared my response, I could already feel the balance shifting. What started as a routine notice had turned into something else entirely. Something the HOA clearly hadn't anticipated, and they had no idea what was about to land on their desk next. By the time I finally decided to respond, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting. The fear that usually followed HOA notices had been replaced with something steadier, something sharper. Preparation. I laid everything out on my dining table like evidence in a case that was about to be tried. Printed bylaws, highlighted sections, photos with timestamps, copies of every notice they had sent, each one more aggressive than the last. What the HOA saw as routine enforcement, I now saw as a pattern of overreach. Instead of sending a quick email, I drafted a formal written response. Not emotional, not defensive, just precise. Every claim they made was matched with a direct reference to the bylaws they themselves were supposed to follow. Every threat they implied was countered with the exact procedure required before such actions could even be considered. I didn't accuse them of wrongdoing outright. I didn't have to. I simply pointed out where they had failed to meet their own standards. I mailed the response certified. Not because I expected courtesy, but because I wanted proof. Proof that they received it, proof that they couldn't pretend ignorance later. And once it was sent, I waited. The silence that followed felt different than before. This time, it wasn't confident. It wasn't dismissive. It was cautious. Days passed, with no new notices, no emails, no letters, slid under the mailbox flag. The daily fines they'd threatened never appeared. It was as if the HOA had suddenly realized they were no longer dealing with someone who would fold under pressure. Then, the tone shifted. A week later, I received a message that was noticeably softer, still formal, still wrapped in bureaucratic language, but stripped of its earlier arrogance. The violation was now described as under review. The fine was temporarily suspended. The board needed time to reassess the matter. It was the administrative equivalent of backing away slowly without admitting fault. That alone would have been satisfying enough. But the story didn't end there. Because once the HOA realized they'd made a mistake with me, they started making more mistakes, trying to cover it up. Another homeowner reached out quietly. Then another. People I barely knew suddenly felt comfortable enough to ask questions, to compare notices, to share stories. Different violations, different reasons. Same vague language. Same rushed process. Same threats. What I had documented wasn't an isolated incident. It was a system. As more information came in, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The HOA board had been issuing fines without proper inspections, sending notices without required warnings, skipping hearings entirely. Procedures meant to protect homeowners were being ignored in favor of speed and intimidation. And now that one person had pushed back successfully, others were starting to wonder if they could, too. The board didn't like that. A community-wide email went out soon after, framed as a reminder about standards and compliance. It read like damage control, a vague attempt to reassert authority without directly acknowledging any wrongdoing. But the timing was obvious. They were trying to get ahead of something they could feel slipping out of their control. What they didn't realize was that their own documents were working against them. The bylaws they leaned on so heavily, didn't just give them power. They also limited it. And now those limits were being read closely, not just by me, but by half the neighborhood. The next board meeting was suddenly standing room only. Homeowners who had never attended before showed up, quietly observant, arms crossed, listening carefully. The board members looked uncomfortable, shuffled papers more than usual, avoided eye contact. Their confidence had been replaced by defensiveness. No dramatic confrontation happened that night. No raised voices. No explosive moments. Just questions. Calm, reasonable questions that exposed how unprepared the board was to justify their actions. Questions about notice procedures? About fine approvals? About documentation? Each one chipped away at the image of competence they'd relied on for so long. Within days, the HOA officially withdrew my violation. No apology, no admission, just a short statement saying the issue had been resolved. But the real shock wasn't what happened to me. It was what happened next. Several other fines across the neighborhood quietly disappeared. Notices rescinded. Deadlines extended. Enforcement slowed to a crawl. The board, once aggressive and eager, suddenly became cautious to the point of paralysis. They had learned the hard way that unchecked authority only works when no one challenges it. Word spread quickly, not just in our community, but beyond it. People talked, compared experiences, shared advice. The HOA's reputation shifted from strict but effective to reckless and disorganized. And once that perception took hold, it was impossible to undo. Eventually, the board changed again. Resignations happened without announcements. New members stepped in, promising transparency and fairness. The tone of communication softened permanently. Notices became detailed if procedures were followed. Fear was replaced with something closer to mutual respect. As for me, life went back to normal. The house stayed exactly the same. The yard looked no different. Nothing about my property ever needed fixing because nothing had been wrong in the first place. The only thing that changed was the balance of power. That original notice still sits in a folder in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of stress, but as proof of what happens when authority assumes compliance without accountability. The HOA expected another easy fine, another quiet homeowner, another win by default. What they got instead was a lesson they hadn't planned on learning. Sometimes, all it takes to shock a system built on intimidation is one person willing to read the rules it hides behind and refuse to be bullied by them.